Today, I will be having a conversation with my colleague and friend, Leslye Kornegay. And in this show, my goal is to bring a fresh perspective to you on all things related to how humans develop their individual brilliance while navigating the excitement, stickiness, and resistance in their relationships. So this is my second interview, or just a visit with Dr. Kornegay. She and I bonded in 2008 as students in an educational policy and leadership studies doctoral program at the University of Vermont. At the time, she was the director of custodial services with a department of close to 300 employees. I came into the program with my MSW. While many of our classmates aspired to educational leadership, Leslye was already there. For those of you who are not familiar with higher education dynamics, the politics are fierce among the academic staff as well as the administration. With my interest in relationship dynamics in organizations, I found Leslye's stories fascinating and had the satisfaction of adding insight that was helpful at times. I found her stories fascinating, and I quickly became Leslye's student. I was humbled by the particular challenges she faced, as well as the fortitude and creativity she brought to what often felt like a snake den. Dr. Kornegay is a lifelong learner. She is a graduate of the College of Education Doctoral program at the University of Vermont. She holds a Master's of Administration from Central Michigan University and a Bachelors of Science in Business Administration with a minor in Organizational Development from the University of Mount Olive. Dr. Kornegay is an executive director with substantial in-house experience leading organizational change in a large higher education institution. She has her high premium, her leadership has high premium on providing exceptional support services for clientele. She focuses on aligning organizational goals with institutional strategic goals, missions, and values. She has broad experience in all aspects of financial management. Dr. Kornegay's area of expertise is in predominantly white institutions, higher education, diversity and inclusion, strategic planning, leadership and change management, women in leadership, succession planning, and mentoring. She has presented numerous presentations and workshops in her area of expertise at the local, regional, and national level. Dr. Kornegay was awarded the Susan Hazazi Alana Award for Outstanding Academic Achievement in Doctoral Education from the College of Education and Social Services at the University of Vermont. She is a member of the International Honor Society Pi Gamma Mu. Dr. Kornegay has a consulting business and a nonprofit foundation. The links to her emails for those enterprises, as well as her personal email, will be in the show notes, and I'll mention them at the end of our talk. So today we're going to talk about Dr. Kornegay's leadership principles and how they reflect her life values, experiences, and aspirations. Welcome, Leslye.
Thank you very much, Mercy, for that wonderful introduction.
Well, that's the mirror. That's all it is, Leslye. So we had a really lovely talk preparing for this interview about your leadership, of which I've been exposed to quite a bit over the years. So let's just start with the basic leadership principles that you have followed. I think one of the first things, of course, that I'd say, of course, because it's, kind of right along with the theme of the show and my interests, is that you started talking about how leadership is about managing relationships. Can you say more about that?
Exactly. And so the first principle that as a leader that I really fell back on was something that my mom said a long time ago. It was about how you treat people. Mm-hmm. And it was about treating people the platinum rule, treating people the way that they want to be treated, not necessarily the way that you would like to be treated. What I added on to that is within the constraints of the workplace that I'm in at the time. Okay. And that has served me well, because what I've found is that you can't treat everybody the same. I know that, there's this thing called equality. Everybody wants to be treated the same. But when it comes to supervising people, it's about getting to know who you're supervising and understanding what motivates them, what drives them to come to work every day. It could be because they really love what they do. Or it could be that I have a family to take care of and I have a newborn on the way, or I'm taking care of my parents. It could be anything. And so, I understood very early on, even before emotional intelligence was the big buzzword, that we're dealing with humans in the workplace that bring their lives to work. There's no such thing as separating, and that, you really need to take time to get to know your employees. It doesn't mean that you have to get personal in their business. See what I'm saying? But you can show that you care. And so I've just tried to treat people the way that I would like to be treated.
So one thing that you mentioned to me when we were talking about that I thought was particularly, I think telling in terms of what you're talking about is you pointed out that people usually spend more time with you at work and their coworkers than they do with their families.
They do, and I think that that's true in most jobs, that we spend more time at work with our colleagues and our customers than we do with our own families and at home. And so, you build these work families, people that support you in a number of different ways. And if you spend any amount of time on a particular job, they do become family. So,
yeah, and then I think, this also, I think leads to another, so it's just a really important perspective that you have on leadership, is just that often leaders are put on a pedestal. And in this intimate and kind of relationship that you have over so much of the life of the person, that then leaders are often expected to play certain roles.
So I realize my experience has been just dealing with my own leadership in different roles over the years, that there was not that intimacy, right? Of that person really allowing you to get to know them. And it really created a distance where they were almost not even like human, you know?
The leader.
Yeah. And I never really wanted to be that kind of a leader. And so I've always tried to be approachable. I think what makes me unapproachable sometimes is my schedule, because I do keep one. And so you can't just walk into my office and start talking, because a lot of times either I'm not there or I'm in a meeting or something like that. But I will make the time for my team members. And so one of the things that one of my employees told me was, "Oh, I love the way you dress. You dress like us." And I said, "Oh, what? Okay, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, you don't dress really stuffy. You dress really nice, but you're just down to earth, you know." And I thought, well, that's very nice. That's really what I would want you to say. Yeah, like, why wear a suit every day if you don't have to? And so at the University of Vermont, I had at least one day a week where we wore jeans and athletic shoes to work. You dress down. But just doing different things with employees, stopping in to see them, seeing how they're doing. Oftentimes they think, "Oh, well, she's the boss. She doesn't really have time. Why is she here?" Because that's what they had been used to. Like, well, I must have done something wrong, and it's not even about that,
So are there times when, if you've developed kind of a relationship of accessibility and partnership with your employees, are there times when that's a problem, or that creates problems?
Well, I will say that when you have an organization, a large organization, and you have direct reports that report to you, and you're trying to ensure that everything gets covered all the time, you do have a situation from time to time where people just think, "Oh, well, I can just, email her today that I want to take vacation tomorrow." That's not necessarily how it works, because you don't know who else has asked for vacation. And I've had situations where, I've had people last minute ask me to do things, and it really creates a hardship. But I go ahead and I do it that time.
Right. So so then sometimes, so then the expectations sometimes kind of that there's going to be a little more, and if you don't have a really rigid boundary, right, and you have a more open flow or a more fluid boundary, so there's still a boundary there, but sometimes it can get a little, different individuals are going to get confused in different ways by it because of
Exactly.
their own expectations.
Exactly.
Then in your positions, you've often been brought in. You've been brought in from the outside. You've been hired from the outside, right? Not from an
Yes.
inside, and brought in as a change agent.
Hmm.
So how does that go when you're walking in? I mean, you're in charge of 100, 200-300 people who've been operating a certain way with their own, let's say, sort of expectations about the job, and perhaps entitlement around the job, different entitlement issues. So how does that go when you come in as a change agent? What's that process like?
Well, employees are just like anyone else. Most people don't like change, um, or upsetting what they're used to doing, or someone telling them that they have to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I will say that in some places that I've been, um, it went pretty well. People were pretty open. I would conduct an assessment. I never come in immediately and start making changes, even though I might see that change need to happen. But I would, observe, do the assessment, make recommendations, and, try to bring employees along as I presented my findings, and then, explain why things needed to be done. And what I will say is, regardless of where I have been up and down the East Coast, the same characters show up.
In different institutions, right?
Exactly.
In different cultures.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Exactly. So you just have to figure out, who is who.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have union employees in your current position, is that correct?
Mhm.
And I don't think there was a union in Vermont, was there?
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
union.
there was a union too.
Different kind of union, but it was
Yeah.
not all unions are equal. It depends on the contract.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, every position that I've had outside of where I am now, the state that I'm in, has been union,
Mm-hmm.
the unionized workforce. And my philosophy there has really been, the contract guides how the employees, the technical aspect, how the employees are to be governed. But it doesn't guide how we, um, get the work done, discipline employees, provide them with the tools and resources that they need, and basically treat them as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So they're still the organization's employees.
Right.
And oftentimes, the union is brought in when that employee cannot get an agreement with the management team about something.
Uh-huh. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
So one thing, there's that we've talked around about is this idea of servant leadership, the servant leadership. Is that what it is? Yeah, servant leadership. And, you know, I think it's really interesting. So when we started talking about that, you started talking about your customers. And I'm thinking, well, you're doing a service. You have basically a service role to the university. Who are your customers, right? And you had a really interesting answer for that. I wonder if you could talk more about that and
So,
how
yeah.
you see your role as a servant leader.
So everybody is my customer, you know, even the employees.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, there's a certain way that you have to carry yourself and you need to interact with people. And, you know, we have our common, you know, like University of Vermont had our common ground. We have something very similar. And
Tell me again, no, could you tell our audience what that is, the common ground?
it's just really, you know, the guidelines that the
Mhm.
institution and then each department um, buys into that how they're going to treat each other and customers, whoever they interact with. And it's things like valuing people, you know, diversity and inclusion, um, trust, that sort of thing.
Mhm. And you have something similar at your current university?
Mhm. Yes.
So that, in a way, sets a tone for your relationship with your employees. But you also talked about how you sort of team up with your employees to serve the other flanks of customers that you have at the university. For example, students who make messes. Right? I was really interested to hear you talk about that and how, and just just sort of how you kind of lead and guide and support your staff in serving,
Yeah.
people at the university that can cause problems for them.
Mhm. Yeah. So it's been different at various institutions. Some institutions, the staff and faculty and students are a little bit more entitled than others
Mhm.
have been. I remember one in particular where if a student did some damage or abused a certain area that we were responsible for, that leader would contact me. They were also over the conduct for students. You know, they would work with the student life group, and they would come to me for the um, discipline. Like, what do you want them to do for you?
Mhm.
Right.
So you're talking about the leader of the board, the kind
So the
of
leader,
disciplinary board in the university. They don't call it discipline, but it's sort of addressing.
well, they call it conduct. I believe that's what they were calling it at the University of Vermont. But
Mhm.
there were
Yeah,
several different. Mhm.
I was on several of those boards. I'd get
Yeah,
pulled in for several
yeah,
cases, as a
yeah,
to sit in. Yeah.
yeah. But they would contact me and say, you know, the kids trash this room, and you know the housekeepers had to go in and clean it, and grounds had to do this, and you know they need to pay. They're going to pay a fine, but they also
Mhm.
need to clean it up. Right? They got sick all over the place, and so I would basically um, let them know what that student or students could do. But my philosophy around it is that we really should be teaching students how to be good citizens,
Mhm.
right? And that sort of behavior, yes, they're at school, and yes, it's a fun time to be away from home, and all of that. We've all done it, okay? but we're still responsible for our actions, especially if we get caught. Okay.
Right.
So that was my philosophy. I wouldn't make it too hard, but I would make sure that they knew who they were working for and why. We would also do like a informational class, right? Like you get to sit down and understand what we have to do, right?
For the students.
Right. And then you come with us and then you do it, right? And that worked out well. And what I found was when we had, we'd always have summer support that we would hire for. Those same students would come work for us.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. They actually liked the relationship and working with us, and they understood better. But I just think, the service employees are in a unique position in a university where they are the people that the students often confide in, right? Because they're there they service the areas that they live in. They see them every day.
Right.
And then I would say more so on that side of the organization in terms of the residence halls than on the academic side, classrooms, libraries, but there's still relationships that are built in. I can remember this very prominent lady where I'm currently working. She told me that the housekeepers, because she didn't have any family that was cheering her on when she was in school, and she was in medical school. And so every time that she had to take a test, they would sit outside and wait for her, right? To finish, to cheer her on. And she still works for the institution and she remembers those people.
Those students, yeah.
Yes. So, it's just a really unique relationship that's developed.
Interesting. So Leslye, it's time for us to take a break. This is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show. I'm here today with Dr. Leslye Kornegay, and we're talking about her experiences and brilliance as a leader. We'll be back after the break.
Have something important to say? Want to help improve our world? Need to promote your business uniquely and effectively? KK&W is the answer. Our staff helps broadcasters and podcasters create professional sounding audio. Bring your talent and let our experts help you craft a radio show or podcast that best delivers your message. Learn more at 1150kknw.com. That's 1150kknw.com. KK&W, talk variety that's live and local. Make it a great day. Keep your dial on Alternative Talk 1150.
Hello, this is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show, and I'm here today with Dr. Leslye Kornegay, and we're talking about her experiences and her insights and innovations as a leader. So we've been talking about your staff and your and your role with your staff in terms of serving different parts of the university. But I also wanted to sort of talk a little bit more about how you develop your staff, right? In terms of what opportunities, how you think about opportunities, and having them develop their own skills, the professionalization of housekeeping. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So the current organization that I'm in, actually the last place I was at too. So the last two places, there was no training set up for them, no formal training. They were getting training in their individual areas. So there was no consistency around what was happening. And so one of the things that I did in both organizations was to have an administrative team, and on that team was a training leader. And that train leader was tasked to develop an in-service for all staff. And so the in-service, what that looks like is every year, each employee gets at least 8 hours of training on the technical aspects of their job. Monthly, they get safety training, some level of safety training that's at the division level that's identified. And so they get quite a bit of training. And then, in their individual areas. One of the things, and this is branching it up a little bit further, a lot of times with organizations like this, if there is training, it's for the frontline staff. But oftentimes there's nothing internal of the organization for leadership. And so one of the things that I've done, and this is the second place that I've done it, where I've partnered with a technical school to offer and an association, partnered them together to offer a certificate of completion. It's 360 hours, so it lasted for 2 years for leadership and management, and all of my leaders went through it. And once they finished, they had a proctored test, and then they received a certification that they really can use anywhere. And that certification is something that on our job descriptions, it's one of the qualifications that we ask for. So in our industry, it just furthers their credentials when they apply for things. And that's pretty significant.
And it's in many ways, it's just such a bonus and a gift as for an employee to receive that. But not all of your leaders were enthusiastic, right, about this, because it's work, right? It's kind of requires work, and they have to pass a test. And
yeah, so in this industry, it's one that's grown over the years, and I've been in it for a long time. I can remember when you didn't even have to have a high school degree. But today you need a college degree. And the closest thing to that is going to be this certification. I got it before I got my first degree, right? So there's entitlement in, well, I've been on this job for 10 years and I should be able to get this promotion. Not necessarily.
Right.
Because you might have been in the job, but there's things that have been added to the job that you may or may not know.
Right.
That's more technical, more administrative and financial, and it's broader.
Well, and that certificate would allow them to go to another institution easily.
Or
and this
be promoted within.
within. I saw this when I worked for an organization that worked with IBM, is that IBM had hired a lot of Vermonters who just had high school degrees, and they trained them as programmers, and they had high level of technical skill, but they didn't even have a college degree. And when IBM cut back their staff, these people, they'd been working for 20, 25 years. They had families and mortgages. And if they went to a job fair in Texas to work for Intel, they didn't have the qualifications, even though they had the experience, because there was all this certification and that had come into the field in that intervening time. So you're really doing you're doing your employees a big favor by holding those standards high for them.
Well, I'm holding it high for them because I know what it was like for me.
Right.
And like I said, I didn't get the first degree until I was, in my 30s, late 30s. And I had every certification that you needed. But I realized that I could not go any further if I did not get a degree, especially in a higher ed institution.
Right.
Everybody has a degree.
Yeah.
So
it's buying into the business, right?
Yeah. And so I don't feel bad about making it mandatory at all. And I will say that the last place that I was at, everybody passed the proctor test and became certified. Okay. And some of these folks English was not their first language.
Right.
Okay. So the people that I currently have, really have no excuse. Yes.
So let's move on to talking a bit more about how you function as a leader within the larger organization. And one thing you talked to me about that was new to me was the concept of building confidence circles. Can you just talk a little bit about that? So
that concept grew out of, when I was doing my doctoral work, and it was on my leadership journey. It's one of the things that came out of that, right? That I realized that I had been doing all along. And that was finding people. I've always been the first, right? The first person of color to do this or to do that, or the only female to do this or to do that. And so I never had role models, right? I never had mentors. And I got there purely by my own wits, so to speak. And, but I understood as I began to grow and I went to different institutions that I really needed people that were going to advocate for me, that were going to support the initiatives that I wanted to move forward. They didn't necessarily need to be like me, right? They didn't have to be Black, they didn't have to be females, and they didn't even have to be in the profession that I was in. But they did have to have my best interest at heart, and they needed to be in a leadership role, seasoned. And so I actually went out to seek these people. And, I've just learned over the years that I would do cold contacts, right? Make appointments. And, I know people are like, why does she want to see me? Right? I don't know her. And by the time I left them, that one meeting, we had a relationship. And from there, we would do lunch, we would do that sort of thing. But every institution that I went to, I understood that that's what I needed to do.
And so tell us what happened in those meetings, right? It sounds, I mean, there are going to be a lot of people going to say, well, what did she do? What did she talk about? How did she approach someone who, it was a cold call. It was a cold call.
Yeah. So I would do my research to start with. I would find out as much about the person as I could. I'd make sure that they were a good fit for me, right? Because I was also looking at my next career move, what I aspired to do next. And so I would do the research first. And when I made those appointments, I'll give you one person in particular who was a hard person to approach and, get an appointment and then go in and talk to. And she told me, she's like, why she want this, because this was like a senior person, right? I mean, I even went to see the president. Okay. But I had to do, there were times when certain projects required presidential level, especially at the University of Vermont. And my position was, I was the leader of that group. So they looked to me to make the recommendations. They didn't put somebody in between me to make recommendations, like I've had at some places, right? So she basically, we just found out that we had a lot in common. I didn't say I researched you and I know about this and I know about that, but I would, proposition the questions and make statements to where it would just keep the conversation going. And before you know it, it was like, Dad, we're out of time. We need to schedule another appointment.
Right. So you'd talk about things that weren't always directly related to work, to form that personal relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. What did you have in common in terms of your life experience, your history, or whatever, schools where you lived, did you find some point of commonality or contact?
And if you go in and you're authentic and you, people know that you're not, it's not me anyway, I don't put on or anything, but you let them know that you genuinely want to know them. And most of the time I didn't have to ask people for things. They would ask me, well, I know about such and such. How do you need my support? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, they'd offer.
Yeah. So I don't see how you can go into any environment as a leader and act independently and be successful unless you were a tyrant. Or a king. Look, or a king.
Yeah, but then you still have to have some followers. You have to have some followers. You have to have your mob behind you, right?
Yeah. I mean, and then the other thing is, it's just the way that you approach people, right? And that's something that, having been a military child and have moved all over the world, I learned and moved a lot very quickly how to make friends, how to leave people and leave them as friends and not say goodbye, and how to make new friends. So, I took that same earlier experiences and in my formative years and applied that when I started my journey north in terms of the different institutions that I was at.
Right, and going into a different part of the country.
Yeah.
So Leslye, our time is getting short. We have about 10 minutes. And of all the things we could talk about,
Uh-huh.
I really want to, one of the questions that that we talked about was, I asked you about what advice you would give for women, for rising leaders, right? And you had some particular advice for women of color who would be rising leaders, but I think your advice is strong enough for everybody. But there are particularities for different groups. But also, I want you to include in that, because I don't want to skip over it too much, the value of data. And because we've been talking about a lot of the soft side of leadership, one thing that you have been, I think, particularly strong in is your comprehension of and your use of the numbers and the data in terms of advocating for certain initiatives. And so I want you to wrap that into your advice for rising leaders.
Well, this may not be true in all institutions, but I know in higher ed, there's a value in, while you may know what to do in most cases, if you can validate that through what other organizations are doing or through a consultant group, then that takes or carries a lot more credibility. Okay. So just going in saying, well, Leslye thinks these 10 things need to happen right away. Okay. That doesn't necessarily make it happen in every institution because you have these different factors, different groups that are they're against anything that you're trying to do. And so you really have to, be strategic in how you go about doing that. Supporting why things need to be done the way that they need to be done. And I've used several consultant firms within my funding. I've always saved dollars. Every institution that I've been at, I've saved over $1 million, sometimes two, sometimes $3 million, just with the changes that were made. So, paying for consulting fees to support initiatives to groups, on campus that are going to fight what you're trying to do, to kind of dispel that, makes a big difference, goes a long way.
Right.
So,
right. And I think you one example you mentioned was the diversity and inclusion survey that your institution had distributed and that you had approached in a very different way than other leaders. And what was interesting when we talked about it was that this initiative came from the top, right?
Right. It usually does. UVM did the same thing. I mean, most institutions at some point do the D&I work, and a lot of times it depends on the upper senior leadership. It just so happens that at this organization, they've only been there a couple of years, and so they're fairly new. And it had never been done before. Because you've had someone in a position for years, right? And it was the same thing at the University of Vermont, if you remember. We had somebody that was in there for years, and then they leave, and it's like, okay, well, why aren't we doing this? We're on the surface saying we want to bring, more students of color to Vermont, well, what are we doing to make that happen? What kind of work are we doing?
Mhm. Well, same with the faculty too.
Yeah,
There was just,
yeah,
there was always how do we recruit, but you can't even recruit faculty unless they've been created from students, right? So to
exactly.
bring
And
those
how do you
different
keep 'em?
voices, and how
Right.
do you to bring those different voices to the
Yeah.
to the to the arena or the
Mhm.
community.
Yeah, and
So
then how do you keep them here? Because you can get them to come, but how do you keep them?
how do you keep them? That's the big
Yeah.
question, the support on all
Yeah.
levels, from
Yeah.
financial to personal.
Mhm.
So on to the question of advice for rising leaders and women of color.
So Mercy, the only thing I can do is go by, what Leslye would do.
Hmm.
And Leslye has never been afraid to back down. Okay. If I saw something or I felt something, I would call it out. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it changed anything. So that's the first thing that women of color need to understand is they have to have a thick skin. You got to be the change. You can't go in and say, why is this like this? Why hasn't this changed? You got to make the change, even if it's one individual at a time. And that one individual may be your supervisor.
Hmm.
Okay. But oftentimes, by being the first person of color or the first woman, then you're the first person like you that they've supervised or that they work with.
Right.
So it's up to you to make it look the way that you want it to look, because it's not like waving a wand and open sesame,
Right.
you know.
Yeah,
So
it's you're talking about really educating
yeah,
your the people that you're accountable to, that you report to, about what particular needs you have and perspective you have that's different than what their perspective would be or what they're used to. But
well
it's
that and it's like I've you hear two different sides to this. Why do I have to educate you?
Mhm.
Okay.
Right.
And I don't disagree with that. But I know where I come from, and it was segregated into integration. And there was a lot of that. Okay. So that's having people treat you the way that you want to be treated, educating them on that.
Right. Letting them know.
Right. So I don't feel less than if I have to educate somebody, but I do get tired of it having to do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference there. And the same can be said for women in the workplace just dealing with men.
Sure.
Okay. Because it's still a very patriarchal?
Patriarchal, right.
Yeah. Workforce, right? Because there was some data I saw where the norm for a CEO or a college senior leader or just any senior leader in any profession is a white male between the ages of 60 and 80 years old.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
right. That dynamic is probably going to change, but that's the way that it has been, and that's the way that it still is today. So you still have a lot of situations, like I told you earlier, where Black women are still the first at something. And I'm so surprised to see that in 2022. First Black woman of this, the first Black woman of that. you know, when we get to the day where you don't have to say that, I think that dream that's been talked about so much would have been realized. Yeah.
Oh, I had to hang up. I know who it is, but I have to call him back. So our time is just about up. And yeah, so I think it is. And we have about a minute or two left. Leslye, how can people get in touch with you? You have so much to offer. You know, you're in the process of, I think writing a book, I heard.
Yes, that's true.
And you run a foundation and you're a consultant. So can you just tell the audience how people can get in touch with you?
So if it's for any type of consulting work, it's Kornegay Consulting at Gmail. If it's just to connect with me, something that I said, something you want to know more about, then it's my first name, last name at Gmail. My foundation, we really didn't have time to talk about that, but it's really about dealing with people on a holistic level, meeting them where they're at and bridging them to be successful. And then, sending them off.
Yeah, mentoring. Yeah,
exactly.
Whole life mentoring.
Right.
Great. Yeah. Leslye, thank you so much for joining us today. And I expect we'll be talking again in the not too distant future. There's always so much to talk about. This is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show. I'm here with Dr. Leslye Kornegay, who's a leader in working in the higher education field. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Leslye, again.
Thank you for having me, Mercy.
Yeah, my pleasure.